In October of 1917, the Great War had been raging for over 3 bloody years. The great powers of Europe had bled themselves white in a senseless, static slaughter, and the Western Front had become a 400-mile scar of mud, wire, and death. But a new energy was arriving in France, a force full of naive confidence and untested strength. They were the soldiers of the American Expeditionary Forces, the Doughboys, and they had come to win the war. The German High Command watched their arrival with cynical amusement. They saw an army of amateurs, cowboys playing soldier, who had no idea what they were getting into. To prove this point, and to send a bloody message to the United States, they decided to orchestrate a special welcoming party. They would hunt down and capture the very first American soldiers they could find. This is the hidden story of America's first day of combat and its first casualties in World War I. It's a story that begins with a moment of immense national pride, the firing of the first American shell, and ends just days later with a brutal, silent raid in the dead of night, a tragedy that served as a horrifying lesson. The war would not be an adventure. It would be a slaughter. This is the day Germany drew first blood on America. The men who would become America's first combatants belonged to the 1st Division, a unit cobbled together from regular army regiments and rushed to France in the summer of 1917. They were under the command of General John J. Pershing, who was adamant about one thing. His American army would not be used as mere replacements to be plugged into British and French units. They would fight as an American army under the American flag. But first, they had to learn how to fight. The French, deeply skeptical but desperate for any help they could get, assigned the 1st Division to a quiet sector in the Lorraine region, near the village of Somerville. The term quiet sector was a grim joke. It simply meant a sector where no major offensive was currently underway. It was still a place of daily death, of random shelling, snipers, and the constant, gnawing tension of trench life. The Americans arrived in their sector, paired with veteran French divisions who were to be their tutors in this new, scientific form of warfare. For the French poilus, weary and cynical after years of fighting, the Americans were a strange sight. The doughboys were clean, well-fed, and full of a boisterous optimism that the French found both amusing and deeply concerning. The Americans were eager to patrol no man's land and get at the Boche. The French, who knew that survival depended on keeping your head down, advised them to learn to live with the mud, the rats, and the random death before seeking it out. This was America's first lesson. War was not about glory, it was about endurance. On October 23, 1917, a moment of immense symbolic importance arrived. Battery C of the 6th Field Artillery was given the honor of firing the first American shell of the war. An artillery piece, a French-made 75mm gun, was carefully positioned. The shell was hand-polished and autographed by the gun crew. At 6:05 a.m., Sergeant Alex Arch pulled the lanyard, and with a deafening crack, the shell screamed towards the German lines. The shot was a message to the world. America was now in the fight. Newspapers back home celebrated the event with patriotic fervor. It was a moment of pure, uncomplicated pride. But on the Western Front, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. The Germans heard the message, and they decided to send one of their own. German intelligence quickly identified the American sector. For the German High Command, the presence of these amateurs was an opportunity. They planned a specialized operation, a Stoßtruppen or stormtrooper raid, with a very specific objective: to capture the first American prisoners of the war. This was not just for intelligence, it was a propaganda mission. They wanted to parade captured doughboys to prove to the world, and to their own troops, that the Americans were soft and could not stand up to hardened German veterans. The target was a small, isolated salient held by a platoon from the 16th Infantry Regiment, near the village of Battlemont. The date was set for the early morning of November 3rd. For 10 days, a special German stormtrooper unit rehearsed the raid on a full-scale model of the American trenches, memorizing every turn, every dugout, every machine gun post. They were professionals, masters of the silent, brutal art of the trench raid. On the American side, the men of the 16th Infantry had no idea what was coming. The platoon holding the forward position was commanded by a young lieutenant who had placed his men according to the textbook. They were in a strong point surrounded by barbed wire, but it was isolated from the main line. This was their second fatal lesson. The textbook meant nothing here. The French had warned them against holding such isolated positions, knowing they were magnets for German raids, but American confidence overruled French experience. The night of November 2nd was cold and rainy. The trenches were rivers of mud. The American soldiers, exhausted and miserable, huddled in their dugouts, trying to stay warm. Just before 3 a.m. on November 3rd, the quiet was shattered. A perfectly coordinated German artillery barrage, a box barrage, erupted around the American position. Shells fell with terrifying precision, creating a wall of fire and steel in front of, behind, and on both sides of the platoon's trench. They were completely cut off. Telephone wires to the rear were severed in the first salvo. Reinforcements could not get in, and the defenders could not get out. As the barrage lifted, over 200 German stormtroopers, their faces blackened with cork, swarmed out of the darkness. They had cut paths through the American barbed wire days before, and they moved with silent practice speed. The Americans were caught completely by surprise. The Germans were in the trench before many of the doughboys could even grab their rifles. It was a short, brutal, and utterly one-sided fight in the dark. The stormtroopers used trench clubs, sharpened spades, and grenades. They moved through the trench with terrifying efficiency, clearing out dugouts and overwhelming the scattered pockets of resistance. An American sergeant, seeing his position overrun, ordered his men to fix bayonets and fight to the last. He was one of the first to die. 3 men were cornered in their section of the trench: Corporal James Gresham of Evansville, Indiana, Private Thomas Enright of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Private Merle Hay of Glidden, Iowa. They fought back, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. They were killed in the mud of the trench they had been ordered to hold. They would go down in history as the first 3 American infantrymen killed in action in World War I. The raid was over in minutes. The Germans dragged away 11 bruised and terrified American prisoners, fulfilling their primary objective. They blew up the American dugouts and then melted back into no man's land before a counterattack could be organized. When relief parties finally reached the trench, they found a scene of carnage. The bodies of Gresham, Enright, and Hay were recovered from the mud. The raid was a devastating success for the Germans and a profound shock for the Americans. News of the first American combat deaths spread like wildfire. Back home, the names of the 3 fallen soldiers became a rallying cry. They were no longer anonymous doughboys. They were martyrs. The incident crystallized the reality of the war for the American public. This was not a distant adventure. It was a conflict that would demand a price in blood. For the AEF in France, the shock was more immediate and personal. General Pershing himself visited the survivors. The official report was stark, concluding that the cause of the disaster was the unfamiliarity of our troops with trench warfare. It was a brutal admission. The confidence and textbook training of the Americans had been no match for the hard-won, professional brutality of the German stormtroopers. But the German plan to shatter American morale backfired. Just like at the Chemin des Dames later, this initial bloody nose did not create fear. It created a cold, burning anger. The story of the raid, and of the first 3 men to fall, instilled a fierce determination throughout the AEF. They had been humiliated. They had been taught a lesson. And now they were determined to return the favor. The incident accelerated the American learning curve. They abandoned isolated outposts, dug their trenches deeper, and learned to respect the deadly professionalism of their enemy. They became harder, more cynical, and infinitely more dangerous. The first shot fired by an American cannon on October 23rd was a symbol of America's entry into the war. The first blood drawn by the Germans on November 3rd was the symbol of the war's true nature. It was a transition from patriotic pride to the grim reality of industrial slaughter. The Germans had come looking for amateurs, and they found them. But in killing Gresham, Enright, and Hay, they had inadvertently created something far more formidable: martyrs. And they had awakened the fighting spirit of an army that would, in the coming year, play a decisive role in their ultimate defeat. The hunt for the first American had succeeded, But the message it sent was not the one the Germans had intended. It was a message that America was now truly in the war, and that it was a war it was prepared to pay for in blood.